After spending 28 years on death row, Carey Dale Grayson was executed by nitrogen hypoxia in Alabama. He became only the third person in the United States to be executed using this method. But to understand how he ended up there, we have to go back. Back to a night in 1994, to the final hours of a woman whose life ended in horror, not because of anything she did, but because her path crossed the wrong people at the wrong time. She was 37 years old, a Louisiana native, a daughter, a mother, a woman named Vicki DeBlieux. On February 21, 1994, she was in Chattanooga, Tennessee, when a friend dropped her off by the roadside. Vicki was hitchhiking, hoping to catch a ride, make her way back home to her mother's house in West Monroe. She never made it. That same night, while traveling through Jefferson County, Alabama, Vicki crossed paths with a group of teenagers. They were drunk, high on substances, and looking for trouble. There were 4 of them. The oldest was 19-year-old Carey Dale Grayson. The others were 17-year-old Trace Royal Duncan, 16-year-old Louis Christopher Mangione, and 17-year-old Kenneth Loggins. To Vicki, they might have just looked like reckless teens. Loud, messy, maybe even friendly. They offered her a ride, said they were heading toward Louisiana. She believed them. She got in. But instead of heading west, they took a detour deep into the woods, under the pretense of picking up another car. It was a lie. And what happened next was senseless and brutal. Once they were deep enough into the trees, far from the road, far from anyone who could hear her scream, they turned on her. They started by taunting her, throwing beer bottles, laughing. When Vicki tried to run, they tackled her to the ground. Then came the assault. Kicks to her head, her ribs, her legs. She was beaten violently, her body overwhelmed by a group of teenage boys acting without conscience, without mercy. She never stood a chance. When they realized she was still alive, Carey Grayson and Kenneth Loggins stood on her throat. She began to gurgle. Her body convulsed, then went still. By early morning, Vicki DeBlieux was dead, and 4 teenagers had crossed a line they could never come back from. But what happened next was even more disturbing. After taking Vicki DeBlieu's life, the teens didn't flee. They loaded her body and belongings into the back of a pickup truck and drove to Bald Rock Mountain. There they stripped her of her ring and clothing. Then they violated her remains before tossing her body off a cliff. She was left there discarded. The group drove to Pell City trying to wash away the red and scrub the vehicle clean. They dumped her luggage in a wooded area, then returned to Birmingham where they dropped off one of the teens, Louis Mangione, at home. But it didn't end there. Grayson, Loggins, and Duncan drove back to Bald Rock Mountain that same night. They weren't finished. Even in death, Vicki was shown no peace. Under the cover of darkness, they mutilated her body, struck and slashed her over 180 times. They cut off her fingers, severed her thumbs, removed part of her lung. What followed wasn't just aggression. It was desecration. A level of cruelty almost too horrific to believe. The next morning, the 3 fell asleep in the truck. When Grayson's girlfriend found them mud-covered and stained with red, she asked what happened. He told her the red stains came from a dog. On February 26, 1994, 5 days later, 3 rock climbers stumbled upon a horrific scene at the bottom of the cliff. Vicki's body. Broken, dismembered, decayed. The damage was overwhelming. Her face had been crushed so badly that investigators had to use an old spinal X-ray to identify her. Her fingers were gone. Her torso had been desecrated. The autopsy concluded the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, with asphyxiation as a contributing factor. It didn't take long for investigators to get a lead. One of the teens had been bragging, showing off a severed finger to a friend. By April, all 4 boys were arrested. The charges were clear. There would be no escape. Grayson's trial wasn't the only one. All 4 were tried separately, and what followed was years of legal battles, sentencing hearings, and appeals. Trace Duncan was the first. On November 2, 1995, just 2 weeks shy of his 19th birthday, he was convicted of homicide. The jury recommended the highest penalty. His sentencing was scheduled for January. 2 weeks later, on November 18, Louis Mangione was convicted. But his outcome was different. The jury recommended life without parole, the minimum sentence under Alabama law. Mangione would never walk free, but he would live. Kenneth Loggins' trial was delayed. A psychiatric report evaluating his mental state had not been submitted on time. When the trial resumed in December, he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. The defense didn't work. He was convicted. 10 of the 12 jurors pushed for the highest penalty. Grayson's trial was the last. It began on January 29, 1996. A forensic psychologist testified that Grayson suffered from bipolar disorder, that he had been in a manic state during the attack. But he also made it clear Grayson could still tell right from wrong. On February 2, 1996, the jury found him guilty. 6 days later, they deliberated for just 15 minutes before recommending the highest penalty. On March 8, 1996, Circuit Judge Mike McCormick upheld the jury's decision. Mangione was sentenced to life without parole. Grayson, Loggins, Duncan, all sentenced to die. Louis Mangione's appeal against his conviction and sentence was dismissed by the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals. The following year, all 3 of the others, Grayson, Duncan, and Loggins, lost their own appeals before the same court. In 2000, Loggins' second appeal, this time to the Alabama Supreme Court, was denied. Then in 2001, the Alabama Supreme Court delivered its final word. It upheld the sentences of Carey Dale Grayson, Trace Royal Duncan, and Kenneth Loggins. The legal avenues were closing. One by one, the courts were done listening. The chamber was waiting. But in 2005, the landscape shifted. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Roper v. Simmons that it was unconstitutional to sentence individuals who were under 18 at the time of their crimes. The decision was narrow, a 54 vote, but it had far-reaching consequences. For Loggins and Duncan, the ruling changed everything. Both had been minors in 1994, and now they were eligible to request a commutation of their sentences. In April 2005, Duncan's sentence was reduced to life without the possibility of parole. Loggins followed in January 2006. A state court officially resentenced him, making him the 13th juvenile to be removed from Roe after Roper, but Carey Dale Grayson was 19. Too old to qualify. And so, the clock kept ticking. Over the years, Grayson filed every possible appeal, to the state, to the federal courts, to the U.S. Supreme Court. All were denied. In 2018, Alabama introduced a new method of execution, nitrogen hypoxia, a process involving the inhalation of pure nitrogen gas, leading to oxygen deprivation and, ultimately, death. Grayson elected for this method. At the time, no one in the U.S. had ever been executed this way. But in January 2024, Alabama carried out the first nitrogen hypoxia execution. It was controversial. The inmate reportedly gasped, convulsed, and appeared to suffer for several minutes. 5 months later, Alabama filed a motion for a second nitrogen hypoxia execution. This time, it was for Grayson. On August 15, 2024, the Alabama Supreme Court approved his death warrant. November 21, 2024. Holman Correctional Facility, Atmore, Alabama. Sentence day. If you're still with us, consider subscribing for more important stories like this. Carey Dale Grayson had been awake for most of the night. He didn't say much. Didn't sleep much either. He was restless, trapped in the final hours of a life that had stretched on longer than most on Roe. He was 50 now, and as the clock moved forward, a weight settled in his throat. He knew time had been generous, because he had made it so. Years of filings, petitions, legal motions. He had fought with everything he had, especially in the final stretch. And even now, in the days after his warrant had been issued, his lawyers made one last attempt. They argued that nitrogen hypoxia, the method Alabama intended to use, posed too many risks. In their filings, they cited the case of Kenneth Eugene Smith, the first man sentenced by nitrogen gas in the state. Witnesses said he had convulsed, gasped, moved aggressively for several minutes before going still. Grayson's legal team argued this could violate the It's Amendment. It wasn't guaranteed to be painless, and they said that it was a cruel and unusual punishment. On October 9, 2024, Grayson's attorney submitted an amended motion. They requested changes to the state's nitrogen gas protocol. At the same time, they asked the court to reconsider, urging that the sentence not proceed by nitrogen hypoxia at all. On November 6, 2024, U.S. District Judge R. Austin Huffer Jr., presiding over the Middle District of Alabama, rejected Carey Dale Grayson's request to halt his scheduled sentence. The execution was scheduled for November 21, with a 30-hour window beginning at midnight. There would be no more appeals. No more delays. Grayson spent his final hours quietly. He didn't sleep. He barely moved. The weight of nearly 3 decades on death row had settled into stillness. On the afternoon of November 21, he was asked what he wanted for his final meal. He requested soft tacos, beef burritos, a tostada, chips with guacamole, and a Baja Blast Mountain Dew. Over his final 2 days, he had 14 visitors. 5 phone calls. The identities of those who came were never disclosed. A last appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court was submitted. A clemency petition sent to Alabama Governor Kay Ivey. Both were denied. At 6:12 p.m., prison staff strapped Grayson to the gurney. A mask was placed over his face. The nitrogen gas began to flow. Witnesses reported that Grayson reacted immediately. His head moved. His body jerked. He pulled against the restraints. He gasped over a dozen short, desperate breaths. At one point, his legs, covered by a white sheet, lifted entirely off the gurney. Then silence. By 6:21, he had stopped breathing. At 6:33 p.m., Carey Dale Grayson was declared dead. He was 50 years old. Governor Kay Ivey released a statement that same evening. She said Grayson's crime was so cruel, so vicious, so outside the bounds of humanity, that the punishment was justified. His execution, she said, bore no comparison to the brutality Vicki DeBlieux had endured. Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall echoed her words, "Justice has been served." But not everyone agreed. Vicki's daughter, Jody Haley, spoke publicly against the execution. She said that society had failed Grayson long before he failed her family. That taking a life in the name of justice does not bring peace. Her words, though powerful, did not change the outcome. Carey Dale Grayson became the 3rd person in U.S. history to be executed by nitrogen hypoxia. The 22nd person executed in the country that year. And so the story ends. On paper, justice may have been served. But in reality, it's hard to say what justice really looks like when so much pain has already been carved into stone. Subscribe for more true crime breakdowns. We tell the stories others forget, with the care they deserve. This has been another true crime case from the Crime Vaults. Thank you for watching. Stay safe and take care of one another.